Now that you're comfortable with the interface and navigating within the interface of Blender, let's look at some basic modeling tools. Modeling in Blender is basically the starting point of most 3D. It is what allows you to create the object that you will later go on to animate, texture, and render. I'm going to show you a series of tools that include selection, transform, and some basic manipulation for modeling tools that will allow you to create the objects that you're going for. Starting out, let's look at selection. If you remember in the previous video, I mentioned the different objects within the 3D viewport, including the camera, the mesh, and the lamp. You can select any one of these objects by right-clicking on them. And you'll notice that when I right-click, they become highlighted in a bright orange. This is what allows you to know that they're selected. You can select multiple objects by holding down Shift and right-clicking on the next object. You'll also notice that as I select multiple objects, the last object selected has a brighter orange than the previous ones. And this is because this is the primary selection, whereas these are the secondary selections. Starting out, this won't have a big effect on you, but you'll come to find that it has an effect later on, but we'll leave that for a later point in time. To select or deselect everything, you can simply hit A on your keyboard to toggle everything off or on. This is very, very handy for manipulating a large number of objects at the same time. So that's basic selection. Now let's look at some very basic transform. And we're going to transform our cube. So first we must select it. So let's right click on that cube, which then highlights in orange telling us that it's selected. To transform your object, there's three basic transforms, and those are scale, rotate, and grab, also known as translate in a lot of applications. There's two ways to do this mostly, and that is either using the viewport manipulators or the hotkeys. Let's start out with manipulators, which you can enable by clicking this small button down here. These are very, very handy for new users as it gives you a visual representation of what you're doing. By default, the translate or grab manipulator is enabled, as you can see here. And you can manipulate your model by left-clicking and dragging on any one of the control points that point along the individual three axes, such as the Y, X, and Z axis. Conveniently, they're also color-coded. If you left-click and drag on any one of these arrow points, you can move that model along the axes. If you don't want to move it along a specific axis, simply left-click and drag within the small white circle to move it freely within the viewport. Next, if you want to rotate your model, simply click on the rotate manipulator, and you are then given three bars along the axes that allow you to rotate your model along the X, the Y, or the Z axis. If you wish to rotate it freely along the origin or along the trackball, simply left click and drag within the small white circle and you can rotate it freely. Next, moving on, let's look at the scale manipulator, which gives you the three small handles again, which you can then scale along each of the three individual axes by left click and dragging, or you can scale along all of them by left click and dragging within the small white circle. Now, a lot of users find that these manipulators are very obnoxious as they constantly get in your way, and it's very easy to accidentally click on them when you're trying to do something else. So let's go ahead and disable those and look at the other method. And the other main method is by using hotkeys on your keyboard, which allow you to work much quicker, but can be a bit of a hard point for new users as you're trying to learn all the different hotkeys. Luckily for us, Blender keeps these very, very easy to memorize for the basic keys. By scale for rotate, R or S to scale, R for rotate, and G for grab. This makes it very, very easy to remember these hotkeys as they translate to the first letter of the word. So that's basic transform. But let's look at duplicating and deleting, for example, if we want multiple objects. If you want to duplicate an object, simply hit Shift D, D for duplicate, on your selected object, and you'll then immediately be moved into grab mode to move that object around. You can then place it anywhere you want, whether it's locked to an individual axis or moving freely. You can place that object with left click. If you wish to cancel that transform at any point during the movement, simply right click or hit escape on your keyboard to cancel the transform. If you then wish to delete that object, you can either hit X to cross it out or delete on your keyboard to delete the object. So that covers all the transform tools for basic object manipulation within Blender. However, this is only working with the whole object. In Blender, objects are comprised of meshes, and these meshes are comprised of vertices, edges, and faces that make up the form. And we would like to be able to manipulate these to better construct the object that we want. And this works through what is called edit mode. Up to this point, we have been working in object mode, which allows us to manipulate individual objects of different types, including the camera, the lamp, the mesh, etc. But if we want to switch to object edit mode to manipulate the vertices, we can either select it from the drag drop up menu here, or you can hit tab on your keyboard to switch into this mode. You'll notice now that our model is comprised of vertices, edges, and faces. And just like with objects, we can select any one of these by right-clicking and shift right-clicking to select multiples on these. You can also deselect any one that you want by shift right-clicking near a selected one to deselect it. And again, you can toggle your selection on or off with A for everything. Now, this is the default cube, and we're going to go ahead and manipulate it a little bit. Just like full objects, you can scale, rotate, or grab it with the same S, R, and G, or by using the manipulators down here. However, I'd like to show you one more tool that really allows us to manipulate this object better, and this is the Extrude tool. There are many tools within Blender that allow you to model anything that you wish, but the Extrude is possibly one of the most important. And this is accessed, again, by just E on your keyboard, or E for Extrude, as it's one of the most commonly used tools. And when you hit E with any vertices, edges, or faces selected, you can then extrude that form to extend it along any way that you wish. So this allows you to create a variety of things and a variety of surfaces for whatever your object may be. I highly encourage you to become comfortable with this tool from the get-go, as you will use it constantly. Now, before we close, I'd like to show you one more thing, and that is how to add new objects. So I'm going to leave edit mode and then hit X to delete this object. I'm going to then switch into top view by hitting 7 on your number pad, which you remember from the interface and navigation video, and then I want to add a new object. You can add new objects by hitting Shift A or going to add at your menu bar, and in this case we want to add a mesh. There's a lot of different objects here, but we're going to completely ignore those for the time being. There's a lot to learn, and so let's just focus on the basics. So if you go to mesh, you can then add any one of the default primitives such as a plane, cube, circle, etc. Let's go ahead and just add a torus. As you can see here, we are now given a torus model that we can manipulate. If we hit tab to go into edit mode, you can see all the vertices, edges, and faces that it's made up of. We can then use duplicate to create multiples. We can extrude it, which in this case, as a whole object, also creates a duplicate. But if we were to deselect half of this, which introduces actually a new selection tool, which is your box select tool, which can be brought up by hitting B on your keyboard, and then you can just draw a box with left click and dragging around the objects that you want. Or if you hit B and middle click and drag, you can deselect anything. And so now we're able to manipulate these forms any way that we wish. Using these primitives allows us to get a more accurate starting point for the model that we may be working with. Next, one more thing that I'd like to show you before closing is deleting within edit mode. In object mode, if you hit delete, you'll delete the entire object. However, in edit mode, you're given several different options. Since a model is comprised of edges, vertices, and faces, sometimes we find it necessary to only want to delete part of those. So maybe I want to delete just this one face within edit mode. And so, with this face selected, I can hit X and I'm given different options. I can delete either the vertices, just the edges, just the face, everything, including which is unselected, only the faces, or what are called edge loops. And edge loops are rings of vertices, but we won't get into that right now. That's for a whole nother tutorial and a whole nother point in time. So, Going back over everything, you've just learned how to transform objects by scaling, rotating, and grabbing. You can duplicate objects with Shift-D, delete objects with X or delete on your keyboard. You can hit Tab to go into edit mode to manipulate the individual vertices, edges, and faces that make up that model. Within edit mode, you can work with each one of those individual elements, which also allows you to use the extrude tool to extrude new vertices, edges, or faces from your current model. And you can delete individual elements by selecting the proper one from the delete menu. And so that wraps it up. From here, we're going to move on to the next section. So stay with us and we'll see you in a second.